Hey Bio30s, it's Manchak here with, can you believe it, your last video lesson for Biology 30. This is it. This is the end. 2 more concepts to go and you guys are done. So if you've made it this far, well done. It's been a tricky go trying to make it through teaching through this pandemic we're going through and doing all of this stuff online. Hey, but you guys have done a great job for making it. So these are the last 2 concepts of Unit D. So before we get to that, I'm going to slide this over here and we're just going to have a quick look of where we've been so far in Unit D. So in population and community dynamics, we've mostly been talking about populations. We first started out talking about a population that's stable and how we could describe the depth of its gene pool and the stability of its gene pool using the Hardy-Weinberg principle. We then moved into talking about how we can change the diversity of gene pools by looking at things like natural selection, genetic drift, gene flow, et cetera, and did some playing around with that stuff. We then moved into talking about different ways we can describe populations. So we can describe them, how they change based on looking at, very simply, how many births, how many deaths, how many things come in, how many things go out in a population. We talked a lot about how populations grow, and we talked about things like growth rate, per capita growth rate, density, all of that kind of stuff. Then we looked at patterns to how populations grow. We looked at S-shaped versus J-shaped curves. We talked about organisms that have different reproductive strategies that make them R-selected or K-selected, and that's where we wrapped up with D4. What we're going to be doing today is covering the last 2 concepts. D5, which has us looking a little bit more broadly at communities, and I'm going to define a community again for you in a minute, just to remind you what it means. And then we'll talk about sort of the interactions within those communities and sort of how the populations of different organisms might change based on the interactions within their community. And then we're going to finally, lastly, talk about succession, and that'll be the last concept that we have for the year. So we'll talk about defense mechanisms and predation, and then we'll also talk about succession, and then that'll be it. And succession is super short, super easy to get. I think you guys will find these 2 concepts fun. I love talking about them because there's a lot of cool things we can talk about with them. So before I get into that, just a couple of reminders. You're going to have all of this information just above where you found this video. So the textbook pages, I've got 2 videos for you guys to have a look at, 2 more of the awesome Amoeba Sisters videos that do an excellent job of explaining the stuff that I'm talking about. And then you'll be wrapping up with some textbook questions as well as finishing up a worksheet on concept D6, or sorry, D5. And there won't be a worksheet on concept D6 because it is really straightforward, and you'll see what I mean when we get there. So I'm going to drag this out of the way and let's jump in. So we're talking about interactions within communities for this concept. And before we get into that, let me just remind you, we've been talking about populations so far. And we defined a populations as a group of organisms of one species that have the ability to interbreed, occupying a given area at a given time. Where we're moving to now is we're getting into talking about communities. Communities are broader than that. They are different species of organisms occupying a given area at a given time. So we've gone from something that is very specific to something a little bit broader now. And I'm going to throw around the term ecosystem as well, because an ecosystem is composed of many communities, but it can be quite a bit more complex. Scientists tend to spend most of their time playing around with populations because it's one organism to focus on. Once you start getting into communities, the complexity gets ridiculous, and it's often difficult to describe exactly what's going on within that community at that point. So let's move on. Interactions within communities. At this point, it's important to realize that we've talked about populations, and we've just talked about that. And we know that populations do not live in isolation. They live in part of communities, which are in turn part of ecosystems. It's these interactions coupled with the interaction between organisms of the same species that shape what an organism is, what it does, and it shapes our ecosystems. So in other words, another way to look at that is there's things that shape populations, so individual species, and the pressures they put on themselves. But there's also the pressure of everything around them that shapes what they are, how they behave, how they appear, all sorts of things like that. And that's what we're going to get into in this concept. The first thing I want to talk about when we get into communities is that there's competition out there, and competition is a huge thing in ecology, and it really does drive what goes on in communities and in ecosystems. Now, we've talked about intra-specific competition, and that is competition within a species, so within a population, between individuals of the same species. So they might be competing for a food source. They might be competing for a mates. They might be competing for a place to build their homes, habitat, those kinds of things. Now we're going to get into, because we're talking about communities, we're going to talk about inter-specific competition. Remember that prefix inter means between. So this is competition between different species, as opposed to intra, which means within. So when we're looking at different types of competition, the greatest competition occurs between species with overlapping ecological niches. If you don't remember what an ecological niche is, an ecological niche is a role that an organism plays within its ecosystem. And that role might be to be a primary consumer, or it might be to occupy a particular part of the ecosystem, or it might be the activity cycle of that organism. Is it active during the daytime or the nighttime? There's lots of different niches that every individual organism occupies. But what happens is when we get when we get niches that overlap with each other, that's where we get competition. Okay, so this leads us to something called Gauss's principle, or competitive exclusion. And what it states is that no two species can remain in competition for the same niche indefinitely, so long as the resources are limited. Okay, what that means in general terms then is that if two species remain competitive with each other within an ecosystem, that eventually one of those two species is going to suffer for whatever reason, because as long as there's limited resources, they can't compete at the same level. One of them is going to win out over the other. So this is going to limit population growth for one species in particular, but likely both. And this extreme type of competition could lead to a species becoming extinct or eliminating the one species. So all of this is tempered by something called resource partitioning, which means the avoidance of or reduction in competition for similar resources by individuals of different species occupying non-overlapping ecological niches. That's a mouthful. Basically, it says that if an organism is competing with another organism and it's losing, it's going to find a way to overcome that competition. It might move away. It might seek a different food source. If this happens for long enough, it might evolve. A favorable mutation may occur for that organism that makes it better able to compete, or maybe it changes and it shifts an ecological niche in some way. So resources end up being partitioned. The results of interspecific competition can take a lot of forms. First, we can get population size of the weaker competitor starts to decline. One species, like I talk about, could change its behaviors so that it can survive by using different resources. Or individuals in one population could migrate to another habitat where resources are more plentiful. All we're saying here is if you put two populations together in a community, in an ecosystem, and though they're part of their biology, part of their ecological niches overlap, there is going to be competition, and survival of the fittest is going to take place. The organism that's better suited to that niche is going to survive better. The other one is going to have to adapt in some way. So each of these will result in competition declining, and we want to avoid competition if organisms are meant to thrive. Okay, so that's interspecific competition. I hope it kind of makes sense when we're describing a community. Now, I want to be clear here that this next thing we're moving into is a little bit different, and we'll get into the differences in a second here. But what we're going to talk about next is predation, and predation is an example of an interspecific reaction, or sorry, interaction, an interaction between two different species in which the population density of one species increases while the population density of another decreases, and the population density of one that increases is the predator population, and the one that follows that is the prey population. Predator eats prey. I hope that makes sense. Now, what's really cool about this, and I remember studying this stuff when I was doing my conservation biology degree, is that there's actually really neat cycles that occur in these predator-prey relationships. And we have an example of this cycle here in Alberta that takes place, and we can monitor it in these populations. And that cycle happens between lynx and snowshoe hares. A snowshoe hare is a rabbit about that size, and I think you guys all know what a lynx is. It's a large cat, not as large as a mountain lion or a cougar, but relatively large cat. I would say, about that from head to tail, with a very short tail. And the prey is the snowshoe hare, and the predator is the lynx. And so what happens is the interaction between the two actually causes populations of the lynx and the hare to cycle. And that's what I'm showing up here. I'll just get my highlighter out and show you guys what's going on. So not my highlighter. I want my laser pointer. There we go. What we have here is in red is the prey population, so we could think of that as the snowshoe hares, and in blue is the predator population. We can think of those as lynx. And what we can see is we've got a bit of a cycle situation, is where let's look at the snowshoe hare. When the snowshoe hare population starts to rise as time goes by, what we see happening is the predator population follows along with it. Because there's more hares to eat, the predators are healthier. They can breed more, have more offspring because they can feed their offspring. But what happens is they push it to the limit, and they push it to their population limit, where there's only enough hares to go around when their population is here. When that population gets too high, they kind of eat themselves out of house and home, and the prey population crashes. Well, if there's not enough around for those predators to eat, the predator population crashes shortly after. And if my memory serves me, and it's getting a little foggier as I get older here, or further away from when I learned it, is that this cycle actually happens over the course of like 10 years. And so we can see that it rises, let's say at year 10, and then it crashes again, and it takes 10 years for it to build back up again to get to where it was before. But these predators and these prey are locked away in this cycle, that as one rises, as the prey population rises, the predator population is going to rise, and so on and so forth. Really cool stuff, if you ask me. You didn't, but I think it's really cool stuff. If you wanted to, there's a predator prey lab on page 767 of your textbook you can have a look at. It just has you playing around with some of these data, and sort of showing you what's going on with those sort of this version of interspecific competition. What I want to get into talking about next is defense mechanisms. And this is all part of how organisms will change themselves over time to decrease that competition that results from an overlapping ecological niche. And so these are things that would happen not overnight, but through evolution, as natural selection sort of takes hold on a specific trait that is favorable for an organism. So these predator-prey relationships we find usually result in evolution of a defense mechanism for the prey. And there's lots of different types of defense mechanisms out there. So for example, there's morphological defenses. Morphological is referring to how an organism looks, physical appearance, its morphology, if you will. And so it might evolve thorns or hooks or spines, or the ability to mimic something in nature, like a leaf. This is a butterfly, actually, or a moth, and it's actually found a way to mimic what looks like a leaf, so it has less chance of being eaten. I think that's incredibly cool. They can end up with passive or behavioral defenses. And these are changes in the behaviors or ways to avoid predators that are not linked to body parts. So they may end up with better senses to hear or abilities to be active at a slightly different time of day that might allow them to defend themselves. And then there's another way, which is the development of toxins or chemicals. And predators learn from experience to avoid eating something that tastes bad. Something that eats milkweed, for example, tastes awful. And I have an example of that in the next slide here I wanted to talk about. And all of this leads to something called mimicry in many cases. So this development of this toxin kind of thing is really kind of cool. And I want to talk about these two creatures in particular right now. So this is a monarch butterfly. Okay, and I know it's the monarch because it's kind of got these little more orangey spots here as opposed to yellow spots. This is something called a viceroy. They're both butterflies. They both appear to be very, very similar. I mean, to the untrained eye, they look to be almost identical, right? But the thing is that the monarch butterfly eats milkweed. It takes stuff off of the milkweed, particularly as a larva, or caterpillar form. And so it eats that. And then when it hatches out, it's got these chemicals in it that taste really awful. And if you are a predator and you eat one of those and it tastes awful, you're probably not going to eat another one again. Here's where it gets really cool. This is the viceroy. The viceroy looks almost exactly the same as a monarch, except that it doesn't eat milkweed. But what it's done is it's developed a form of mimicry. Basically, it's a harmless species that mimics a harmful organism. So this tastes awful, right? This doesn't. But it appears like it tastes awful because it looks very, very similar to this one. So the monarch tastes awful. Animals learn that eating something that looks like this tastes awful. So I ain't going to eat this because it's going to taste awful too. Does that kind of make sense? So that's an example of mimicry. Another example is this thing right here. This is a syrphid fly. Okay, syrphid. They are a specific family of two-winged flies that exist in the world. Well, you can see that they have that black and yellow patterning that looks very similar to what you would find on a wasp or a bee. We know that wasps and bees sting, and if you try to eat one, it's probably going to hurt. My dog tried that once. It was really funny. Poor guy swelled up. But hey, you know what? He learned his lesson. He probably isn't going to eat anything that looks like this either. This thing is not going to sting you. It's got the wrong kind of mouth parts, doesn't have a butt that's going to sting you. And so it's not going to hurt you, but it looks like something that's going to hurt you. There's a defense mechanism to prevent you from getting eaten by a predator. Morphological mimicry, really cool stuff, I think. I got something even cooler coming up, so just don't turn the video off. It's going to gross you out. It's even better. Okay, so that's defense, some of the defense mechanisms, and remember, they all evolve as a way to try to stop that overlap, that predator-prey relationship, and get out of the ecological niche to prevent you from getting eaten so much. The other thing that can happen is that if we can't get rid of that competition, maybe there's a way that these organisms can occupy the same space, and there might be something that could be beneficial, or something that goes on. So some of these interactions are really harmful interactions. Some of these interactions can be beneficial. Some of these interactions, there's no effect of them occupying the same or similar niche. So a symbiotic relationship is what I want to talk about next. And these are you guys have studied these before, way back in probably elementary, maybe some junior high, but let's go back and revisit them. A symbiotic relationship is one in which organisms of two different species live in close physical contact for a significant period of time. And I want to highlight that. They live in close physical contact for a significant period of time. That's important, okay? Because it is not predatory, or it's not a predator-prey relationship. This close physical contact happens for a while. In a predator-prey relationship, the hawk comes down, grabs the gopher, kills it. That's the level of interaction. That's it. In these kinds of interactions, they happen over a long period of time. There's three kinds of symbiosis that take place, and I want to talk about each of them. But I'm going to just quickly summarize them for you here, just so you guys are aware of, if I can make my pen work, are aware of what's going on here. Let's use yellow as our color. So in mutualism, if we look at the two organisms that are evolved, they both benefit from the interaction. So I'm going to use plus for benefit and minus for one getting harmed. Okay. In a commensalistic relationship, neither one benefits or is harmed. Right. So in this case, everybody's happy in this relationship. Right. In this relationship here, neither one is benefited or harmed. One benefits. Let's scratch that out. One benefits, and the other one is like, meh, doesn't really affect me at all. Okay, so one's happy, and one is neither benefited nor harmed. In the second relationship, or the parasitism, one benefits, and the other one is actually harmed. There's something that's wrong with that relationship, and it harms that organism. So what I'm going to do is talk about some of these, and I'm going to try to use some examples that you might encounter out in the world of this. So mutualism is the first one. It's a type of symbiosis where both organisms involved in the symbiotic relationship benefit from that relationship. And so there's some examples I can explain to you. One of them is what happens with our gut bacteria. There are bacteria in our guts, particularly in our small and large intestines, that are there mainly to help us with digestion process. And what they benefit from is they get food and nourishment and a place to live. So they're both benefiting from that. Another good example of this are cowbirds and bison. So these birds here, there's one there, there's one flying. I was seeing these at the cabin when we were up there this last weekend. Those birds are called cowbirds. They're called brown-headed cowbirds to be particular, because they have brown heads, and they hang around bison herds. And if you went out to Elk Island, you'd probably see them or some other kinds of blackbirds hanging around there. What they're going to do is they hang around the bison herds because the bison are relatively dirty animals that smell bad, and so they're going to attract flies. The flies are going to come along and they're going to, harass and eat the stuff off the bison, while at the same time, that's going to bug the bison. Well, these brown-headed cowbirds benefit from that relationship because they benefit from being around the bison because they get to eat the bugs. The bison benefit from this relationship, mutualistic relationship, because there are less bugs around because the cowbirds are eating them. So both organisms are benefiting by interacting closely with each other over a long period of time. Another example, or the next kind of relationship here, is commensalism. And this is a type of symbiosis where the one organism benefits and the other one is neither harmed nor benefited. So it's kind of a neutral interaction, if you want to call it that. Arctic foxes and caribou are an example, but the one that I want to talk about here, which is a one that, again, we can find here in Alberta, is between yellow-bellied sapsuckers and ruby-throated hummingbirds. And then there's actually something in between here, a tree, particularly deciduous trees, birch and aspen are the usual suspects. So this is a yellow-bellied sapsucker here. It's a type of woodpecker. It's yellow-bellied. It doesn't actually suck sap. What it does is it goes along and it drills these little tiny holes in the barks of the trees. So they go around and they make, in these horizontal sort of patterns, all of these little tiny holes. And the purpose of drilling these holes is that it causes sap to leak out. And early on in the spring, when the sapsucker is doing this stuff, what that does is that provides a sort of sweet nectar for things like ants and other insects. And so the sapsucker drills these holes. All of these ants get attracted to the sap that's coming out of the bark. And what ends up happening is the sapsucker can come in and eat the ants or other insects that get stuck or are feeding on that. So this sapsucker might go and have several of these trees and make a circuit through these trees, eating insects along the way. The sap doesn't give them much benefit. The insects are chock full of proteins and fats that are healthy for them. How does the ruby-throated hummingbird factor into this? Well, ruby-throated hummingbirds often come back on migration well before flowers are fully in bloom in the wild. And so what ends up happening is the sapsucker comes along, drills these holes, and you know, the trees start leaking out sap that is watery and sugary. We know that that attracts the insects, but hummingbirds don't eat insects. Hummingbirds eat sap or nectar. Since there's no flowers around, they're going to go and find the sap that is leaking out of these trees, and they're going to use that as their food source. A ruby-throated hummingbird is not going to be able to drink all of the sap out of a tree by itself. So that doesn't harm the sapsucker. The tree is still going to be releasing its sap, and that doesn't benefit the sapsucker either. So the sapsucker is neither benefited nor harmed, but in this relationship, the ruby-throated hummingbird is experiencing a benefit. So that's an example of commensalism. Now, this is the one I've been waiting for. I wait for this point every year. I love talking about this form of parasitism. This is so messed up. You guys are going to love it. And if you don't believe me, look this up, because I'm not feeding you a line here. So parasitism is the last one I want to talk about. And the root of this is parasite. Okay, so parasitism is a type of symbiosis where one organism in the relationship benefits and the other organism is harmed. Okay, and this is one of the more common symbiotic relationships where one benefits and one is harmed. And there's lots of examples out there. For example, the yellow-bellied sapsucker in the birch tree. The yellow-bellied sapsucker benefits from that relationship. The birch tree is being harmed because it's losing its lifeblood. But the one I love talking about is this one, between Schistocephalus solidus and grebes. Particularly, I've shown up here for western grebe. But Schistocephalus solidus is a tapeworm. Okay, and it's a little tapeworm that needs to go through a life cycle. And in its life cycle, it's got a bunch of things that are involved in it, and it's parasitic, particularly of both the western grebe here and this creature here, which is called a three-spined stickleback. Okay, are you ready for this? So the Schistocephalus, let's start with its adult form, the adult tapeworm form. The adult tapeworm form starts inside a grebe. A grebe has gone and eaten a fish. Grebe are fish-eating and invertebrate-eating birds. And so the grebe has gone and eaten this little stickleback. And inside the stickleback were eggs of the... I want to make sure I get this right, were a larval form of the tapeworm, the Schistocephalus tapeworm. And so what ends up happening is the western grebe goes and eats the tapeworm, and the tapeworm in its larval form gets inside the western grebe, gets into its digestive system, and the larval form develops eventually into the adult form, and in the adult form lays eggs. And what ends up happening is the eggs are laid as inside the poop of the western grebe, and the western grebe poops, it floats down to the bottom, and the eggs lay there. Okay, the eggs lay at the bottom, and as part of the detritus, the broken down part of the the bottom of the lake that the grebe is pooping in, and little organisms called copepods, which are small invertebrates, come along, and they're kind of like decomposers. They eat detritus, the dead and decaying material at the bottom of the lake. They eat it up, and they get the eggs inside them. And then those eggs, those copepods, get eaten by the stickleback, because that's what the stickleback feed on. And now we've got these eggs inside the stickleback that hatch into larvae. Then it gets really cool. The larvae hatch, and then they start to release a chemical that I'm not going to get into. But what it does is it changes the brain chemistry of the stickleback. Okay, changes the brain chemistry of the stickleback, and what ends up happening is the stickleback, instead of swimming away from predators, swims towards predators. So that little larva starts to release a chemical, messes with the brain chemistry of the stickleback, and the stickleback, right, which now has a parasite inside it, starts swimming towards predators instead of away from predators. Why? Because the larva wants to get eaten. Why does it want to get eaten? so that it can grow up to a tapeworm and live inside the grebe and feed off of what the grebe is doing, so that it eventually can lay its eggs in the poop, and the poop can be pooped out into the bottom of the lake, and the cycle can continue. Okay, so there's some examples of parasitism here, right? So one organism parasitizing two, maybe three other kinds of organisms to complete its life cycle. Isn't that completely messed up? I think it is. I think it's fantastic. So that's, in this case, the schistocephalus, the tapeworm, is benefiting from being part of the copepod, because then it knows it's going to get eaten, right, by the stickleback. It's benefiting from being in the stickleback because it knows it's then going to get eaten by the western grebe. And it's benefiting by being in the western grebe because it knows that it can have the nutrients that it needs in order to develop into an adult, so it can lay its eggs and start the whole cycle again. I love it. It's completely messed up. That's nature. If you don't believe me, I'm pretty sure I got all of that right, but it's really, really cool stuff. So that wraps up the last little bit of, or the first bit of D6. The last thing I want to do is to finish up D6 talking about succession super, super quick. Because this is sort of a big scale kind of thing that we're going. So we kind of went from small and we're going big to end this off. So succession is the last thing I want to talk about, and it's an ecosystem level kind of thing. Every ecosystem starts from something and gradually changes as time goes by. A typical deciduous forest will gradually change into a coniferous forest. A bare patch of rock will eventually, over perhaps millions of years, turn into a forest. It will develop a soil, and it will go from there. The gradual change of an ecosystem, now we're moving broader again, ecosystem, is from one form to another, is called succession, right? This form is succeeded by this form, which is succeeded by this form. In many cases, succession is predictable, where an organism that occupies an ecosystem, those organisms gradually change as time goes by, as the ecosystem shifts from beginning to end. The ultimate result of succession is reaching what we call a climax community, a stable ecosystem that our old growth forests here in Alberta would be considered to be. There's two kinds of succession that take place, and what's really important for me at this point, guys, is can you distinguish between these two kinds of succession? So the first, and both of these types are dependent on what is present at the beginning. Okay, primary succession is a form of succession where there is no plant life present to start with. Usually there is no soil present to start with. So primary succession is the occupation by plant life of an area not previously covered by vegetation. This means that it is a very slow process, usually requiring some sort of lichen to kick it off. Lichen is a symbiotic, mutualistic relationship between algae and fungus, where they basically eat away at the rock and convert the rock gradually into the nutrients that it needs to survive. When those lichen die, they can start to create a very rudimentary soil from the rock that they've broken down and from the dying and decaying lichen. Once the rudimentary soil is produced, a seed could take sprout in that area and could start to grow plants. Okay, so vegetation will grow at that. So this usually happens on bare rock that had been laid down recently. So think about volcanoes, or maybe an island that has recently risen up as a result of tectonic activity or something along those lines. The kind of succession that we are most familiar with is the succession that takes place in an area that previously was covered by vegetation and still has soil present. So it is a much quicker process. Usually happens after there's a significant natural or artificial event, like a forest fire, a flood, or some sort of human alteration of the ecosystem. And that secondary succession happens very rapidly, and it can take, instead of taking hundreds, if not thousands of years to get to the first community there, this one might take months to get to that first community there, depending on the natural disaster that occurred or the artificial event that occurred. So this diagram that I have here basically sort of shows you the progression then. So I'm gonna rewind for a little bit. Succession is the gradual changing of an ecosystem over time. Whether it starts from bare rock, which is primary succession, or from a soil already established, which is secondary succession, it's still going to follow this same pattern. And the pattern is, right, starting in this case with primary succession with bare rock, the first things that establish are simple plants like rocks or like mosses and grasses. And then as time goes by, grasses and more perennials come in. So this is stage 3. Perennials are things that are around year after year. Then we start to get the woody things present in there. So shrubs, maybe small trees. Then we get faster growing trees that are usually deciduous. And then we end up, deciduous here in Alberta. And then we end up with our climax communities, where we've got our coniferous trees that gradually start to replace the deciduous trees. If we end up with a secondary succession event, an event that maybe a forest fire rolls through and wipes out this, then we go back to over here where there's a soil to start with already, and we start to get those mosses and grasses and start to creep back in and things come back. And the succession from here to here to here might take only a few years. To get to the climax community in Alberta, you were usually looking at 60 to 80 years, maybe longer, depending on where we're at and the climate that we're in. To get from here to here, to get from no soil to a soil that's established and we can start growing plants on it, like I said, could take thousands of years for it to happen. Ladies and gentlemen, that is all I have to teach you guys in Biology 30. That is it. This you can read through on your own, but that is it. That is Biology 30. We've made it through all of the concept in Biology 30. So kudos to you if you've made it this far. Kudos to you for sticking it through. If you're reading this or watching this in 2020, when we've just gone through, this isolation teaching sort of thing that we're going on, well done making it this far. Congratulations. I am going to wrap it up by just saying to you guys, don't forget that we've got a few things to work on here. You've got some questions in the textbook if you want to tackle them. You've got a worksheet number 2, questions 7 through 12, which will take you through concept D5 and a little bit of D6. And then you've got your formative quiz coming up. Do the formative quiz, wait for my feedback, and then move on to the summative quiz when I've given you the okay. Hey, well done making it this far. Thank you very much for giving me your attention through all of this. I know that it is incredibly boring sitting here watching me go through these things and not having that interaction that we have in class. If you have any questions, track me down online, come in for a Google Meet at some point, and we'll go from there. Other than that, I hope you guys are staying safe and healthy, and we will talk soon, I hope, very soon.